So if we swing the camera back over here just a little bit and zoom in, we can see the top of that unit where the cable assemblies from the throttle come into. So right there is probably the electronic module that takes the input from the throttle cables and turns it into an electric signal to then control the throttle. If we move back here just a little bit, we can see this great big channel under the seat for airflow into the top of the airbox. So underneath this plastic cover right here is a big cavity, which is a cavity between the airbox and the black fender. And then if I look way down in there, I can see an intake boot. It's probably a good 3 inches back down here in this, behind this, yeah, there it is right there. I'm tapping it right now. So it is about that far back in. But I can see how having it buried back there and then having this little plastic cover up on the top would drastically reduce the amount of noise from the intake. If we look at the top of the battery, we can see that it is actually kind of tucked inside of the bike a little bit. So this big battery assembly is mounted inside of the subframe, meaning it's pushed in towards the tire just a little bit. And right back here, my light is pointing at right now, there's some cooling fins. So that is probably the regulator rectifier right there. And then if I look behind the solenoid, I can see the metal body of it. Here we have 2 negative cables, and then we have our starter lead right there. That's the starter solenoid, which I had mentioned earlier. But then it all comes into one main wiring harness that routes up towards the front of the bike. Might as well look underneath the rear fender too while we're at it. So here we're looking at the back side of the battery box, the underside of the fender, and you can see the legs for the subframe that extend out under the fender. And in my first deep dive video, way back in about November or December, I pointed out that the subframe has these cast pieces in it that is welded between the tube portions of the subframe. That is a different arrangement than the current DR-Z, the old one, I should say. I was really hoping that the racks from the old school DR-Z would work on the new, but I know for a fact that they won't, because the spacing between those two holes is a 1/4 of an inch difference. The black rear fender piece does appear to be a 2-piece unit. We've got this bolt here and one over on the other side that hold it to the subframe, and it also bolts the 2 pieces together. And then we have another set of bolts right here that bolt the 2 pieces together. And then I do also see 2 more bolts right up there. Yep, those 2. I'm pretty sure that this battery box was pre-engineered for a battery tender lead, because you've got this little notch cut out right there. Just like the previous generation DR-Z, this one will have a continuous power draw by the instrument panel. So in the manual, there's mention that if you leave the bike sit for more than 2 months to hook it up to a battery charger or disconnect the battery. I've always kept a battery tender on mine. Anytime I forgot to do it and killed the battery, I could only get about another year out of the battery, and then the battery was toast. So I religiously have to remember to keep the darn thing on a battery tender when it's in storage in my garage. So I need to do the same for this bike. I do want to look at something on my old DR-Z real quick. So I have had IMS foot pegs on this bike for quite a few years, probably since the day I started converting it to my own liking by doing upgrades to it, which was before I started to ride it. This is the second set of IMS foot pegs. These are the Pro Series that I found online for a super good deal. So they are close to 2 inches. They're probably like 1 15/16 of an inch wide. The new DR-Z has foot pegs that are definitely wider than the stock foot pegs on the old DR-Z. These are really close in size to the IMS foot pegs. It looks like these are 1 7/8 versus the IMS pegs being 1 15/16. So I don't see the need to replace those foot pegs. I'll just pull the rubber inserts out when I get to doing my off-road riding. If we look here, right rearward of the exhaust, at the bottom of the frame down tube, we can see an oil drain plug that is offset to the left side of the bike, and then offset to the right, tucked in right behind the skid plate. We can just barely make out a hose and a fitting where the oil would drain back down into the engine. That is just like the old school DR-Z. First couple oil changes, I pulled that hose off of that fitting, threaded that fitting out of the frame, and cleaned the screen on the bottom of it. Since the first few oil changes, I've probably only done that twice in the last 19 years of owning the bike. There is no mention of that oil strainer in the oil change procedure in the owner's manual, but it is discussed in the engine lubrication system section of the service manual. It's shown on 1E-7 and 1E-8. It's called the frame head under strainer, and it looks identical to what was in the old school DR-Z. The frame is a nice semi-gloss finish instead of gloss finish. So everything down below, as far as the design of the frame, looks to be the same. So with any luck, skid plates from the old DR-Z will fit the new. That's something that I will be trying out here within the next few days, and I'll post a video of my findings on that. It does use the same oil filter right here. This engine case, or the clutch case cover, has been redesigned. Unfortunately, getting access to the clutch requires removing this entire case, which is kind of a bummer. I guess I shouldn't say that it's a big deal for me, because my bike has 22,000, well, almost 22,000 miles on it, and I've never had to do anything to the clutch. While I'm down here looking at the bottom, so there's kind of a unique design to this frame. You can see how you've got this cross piece here that goes left to right, and then this little spot here, and then this tube here. So this tube here comes off of the frame, the main frame, the engine cradle, and then that's what your foot peg is bolted to. So you have this little triangular shaped piece. When I was first shopping for skid plates, I looked long and hard to find a skid plate that protected this area. A lot of skid plates, they just follow this main tube straight back, and they didn't provide protection here, or they stopped part way and didn't provide much of any protection back here for this area. So that's something that I will definitely do on this bike, is get a skid plate that provides full width protection out to this area. The skid plate I had on my old school DR-Z, it was made by a company in Enumclaw, Washington called Duval Racing. That skid plate took a beating, and it was just last year that I took it off and sold it and put a different skid plate on. I think there's one last thing I wanted to point out. So first, let's take a look at my old DR-Z. So something that was a common issue when bikes were ridden hard, and especially when they were dropped on the left side, is the OEM clutch lever could puncture the case. It was aluminum, and it had enough flex in it, and it had a nasty sharp edge. This one actually kind of has a sharp edge too. It's kind of squared off right there. This is I think it's an IMS shift lever. It's extended length. That's why it extends so far forward compared to what the stock one does. But I've seen a number of bikes where they did not have case guards, and they were running the stock shifter, and the shifter would even flex enough shifting where it would dig into the case just a little bit. Anytime I ever take a shift lever off, I always try to bias it towards as far out as it will go when I'm tightening up the bolt. On the shift shaft, you have a little groove that the bolt goes down into that groove or through that groove or whatever, and there is just a little bit of in and out play before you tighten up the bolt. So on the new DR-Z, this case has been redesigned and the shifter has been redesigned a little bit. So let's go take a look here. So the case has a little bit more of an angle right in this area, and then look at the shifter. Anybody that still has an old school DR-Z with a stock shifter knows how much different this is from the OEM shifter on the old DR-Z. So this is a complete angle here. A lot of people, what they would do is file off this squared sharp edge, because it literally was a squared off sharp edge. So hopefully soon, someday anyway, somebody will develop case guards for the new DR-Z. I have had those case guards on since shortly after buying the bike. So I bought mine from a company who was essentially, they were the originators of this case guard. It was called CFC. So if anybody can tell me what CFC means, post that in the comments below. It'll be interesting to see if anybody is old enough and goes far enough in the DR-Z community, far enough back in the DR-Z community to know what CFC stood for. For a while there, when CFC was still in existence, they were private labeling these covers for Thumper Talk, the Thumper Talk forum. I did just think of one other item. So I've taken this bike out on a few rides over the last few days, and yesterday when I got back, I noticed that this side panel, the top two clips were undone and the side panel was kind of flapping loose. So it's sort of tricky. You have to be pretty deliberate about getting this bottom piece fully inserted into position when you lock the key for it. Because if it's not fully seated flat or in as far as it needs to go, it won't latch and secure the top correctly. There's enough outward movement where the top came loose. I fumbled with it for a little bit and finally figured out what the issue was. And yeah, I think that pretty well covers the deep dive discussion.